Looks like
Hi,
I think
everybody.
we have everybody. So thank you for coming to our academic affairs meeting, our presentation. There's two items on our agenda today. One is the data that was requested, and two, a special report from special education. And the first part, the data, I wanted to let you know, Abby, we only got part of it. We got the comparison data in terms of numbers of students with IEPs and 504s, but I didn't get a lot of data about the DHH program because that is kind of undergoing review right now. And so we'll probably be doing something about that, like in terms of a report later in the school year.
Cool.
But that's going to be a big full-blown thing with a lot of information and a lot of changes. So too much to do a little soundbite. So
Yeah, no
anyway,
problem. And when she says data requested, Dr. Promo said like, hey, what do you want to do with this meeting? Because we've just said special education in general. And I said, you know, I think there's a perception that our data for IEPs and 504s has been going up, and we may want to talk about like what the distinction is between those two things, just to kind of get everybody grounded in where we're at. And just, you know, talking about kind of what our special education team is prioritizing this year.
Great. So let me start with the data. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see it now? Okay, great. So Dr. Anders was kind enough to pull this data for us. And you can see the first slide, excuse me, let me start with the beginning. The first slide here has it by school, and it's comparing the data from 2018-19, which was pre-COVID, with today's data, which is 2023-24. And I was actually very surprised by this because you can see if you look at the totals at the bottom, the data is pretty constant. You know, we haven't, even though the perception is that there's been a lot of change, I don't think that's really the change. What has really changed is that there's been a lot more students with acute needs. And so the numbers are the same, but the needs are different in terms of a lot of response from staff, a lot of extra supports that are required, but not necessarily as you can see in the actual numbers. So this is the data by schools. And this next slide shows the data by grade level. And this is really TK to 12th. So it doesn't include like the adult school or other outside programs or placements where we have special education students, but it does have the same kind of, not a whole lot of changes in grade levels. You'll see a little bit, but really overall, between those years, it's pretty constant as well. And the difference, as you had mentioned, between special education and 504s is that they fall under different legislation. So special education students are identified through IDEA and the IDEA, and the 504 students are general education students who also have identified significant needs that we accommodate. So those are the differences between those. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's it in a nutshell. So I did want to show, though, again, by grade level, even it still looks pretty constant. And so that was surprising for me. But so I'm going to stop.
That is surprising, given I feel like what folks have been saying. But it's interesting context to think that, you know, just maybe the number of students has not changed significantly, but the needs themselves are significantly more
Challenging.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so that was the data. And then Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and begin your presentation, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, great. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. I have to practice this for a second. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. Well, hello. I'm Jennifer Nicholson, Special Education Director. What I was looking at, see, now I can't figure out how to go backwards. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop sharing for just 1 second. Because the screen, it was going faster than I wanted it to. Okay, we'll try this again. Slideshow. Okay, here we go. So what I'm talking about this evening is about improving compliance and enhancing achievement. So a little bit of background about this information. This is data that CDE collected. And for those of you who are unaware, California Department of Education, CDE, oversees the state's public school system to ensure educational law and regulations are enforced, supports school districts with maintaining accountability, and monitor educational programs needed for improved student achievement. And in this last year, in 2022, for all districts throughout the state, so I just wanted to highlight, not just for Burbank, but for all students across the state, CDE released a compliance monitoring system designed to identify areas for improvement in compliance, disproportionality, and/or performance. And so in terms of the findings for Burbank, what you see is that we were not significantly disproportionate in any area. So areas where it's students with disabilities as it pertains to suspensions for duration, setting, race and/or ethnicity, placement, overall placements or identification for special education, or identification of certain races and/or ethnicities within a specific disability category. So our district was in compliance in all of these areas.
Jennifer, can I stop you right there for a second? Can you explain for the group what disproportionate means?
That means that we have over-identified a student from a certain group, certain subgroup. Could be race, it could be ELL status, it could be so like different subgroups that would be identified.
So essentially our students with disabilities, the demographics match our general population. Is that what they're looking at?
Exactly.
Okay.
Where the district was found to need improvement, and I say it that way on purpose, because these areas, once I get into it a little bit more, you'll find that these were some kind of minor areas. But the performance indicators that needed improvement were with participation and performance of our students with disabilities in the statewide assessments for English language arts and math. Students with disabilities who are served within the regular class 80% or more of the day. And regular class, you'll see that it's quoted a little in some slides later. Regular class, according to CDE, are our general education classes. And then students ages 3 through 5 enrolled in a preschool program, attending a regular early childhood program and receiving the majority of their special education and related services in the regular early childhood program, and/or attending a separate school or residential facility. And I'll get into what that means a little bit more in some following slides as well. The other area where the district needs improvement is with the compliance indicator. And this is holding IEP, individualized education plan, so IEP meetings and assessment meetings within their compliance timeline. So in terms of statewide assessment, for 2022, The overall data for Burbank District, we had about 14,331 students attending in Burbank Unified. Of those, 6,863 students took the state assessment. These are students grades 3 through 8 and 11, because those are the grades that students take the annual statewide assessment. Overall, so all of the students who took the assessment, the district was at a 17.8 points above standard in language arts, and was 19.1 points below standard in math. And when you sort of dive deeper into the data, of the 13 subgroups that were reported during that 2022 school year, one of those subgroups are the students with disabilities. And of those students with disabilities, there were a total of 1,794 students, or approximately 12.5% of the population. And this 12.5% of the population is preschool through transition age. So I just wanted for you to see that distinction between students who were assessed overall for the entire district, and then this almost 1,800 student amount. This is preschool through transition age. Diving deeper into the data, students with disabilities who took the English language arts portion of the statewide assessment, per California dashboard, we had 1,008 students who were included to participate in the participation rate denominator. But of those 1,008, there were 908 students who were tested. Students with disabilities scored in the very low range with an average of a negative 73.1 from the standard. And the participation rate is that the state set is 95% or higher. Because we had 908 students who participated, we had a participation rate of 90%. So 90% of our students with disabilities took the English language arts statewide assessment. And so this resulted in a loss penalty of 45 points because that participation rate was below 95%. And loss penalty, this is when loss penalties are applied to every student who did not participate. So calculation of loss penalties occurs by taking the number of students with valid scores and who are continuously enrolled, plus the number of loss scores added due to the participation rate being below 95%. So that's what loss penalty is.
Can I ask a question, Jennifer?
Yes.
So California thinks, or the state of California seems to think that we had 1,008 students who were in grades 3 through 8 or 11 that should have been eligible to test, and 908 of them did test. Does that denominator include any sort of like opt-outs? Do we know kind of generally why our participation rate was lower than 95%?
I'm glad you asked that, and that's my hypothesis is on the next slide. So I'm glad you asked that question. With math, so finishing up, and then I'll go into the answer for that. So in the area of math, per the California dashboard, Burbank had 1,009 students who were included in the participation rate denominator. Why there's that one student difference, I'm not sure, but this is what the California dashboard has. And so of that 1,009 students, 903 were tested. So this resulted in an 89% participation rate for students with disabilities. And there was a loss penalty of 51 points. So what happens? Students with disabilities subgroup is revealed to have a very high rate of chronic absenteeism. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we had fewer students who actually participated, but it could also include those students who were opted out. So 28.7% of students with disabilities were chronically absent this last year. That means 380 students in kindergarten through 8th grade who were absent 10% or more of instructional days. That does not include 11th grade because the dashboard doesn't have that grade for the chronic absenteeism. So that 380 is just kinder through 8, but we know that the 1008 and the 1009 were based on grades 3 through 8. So how does this get addressed? You know, what is the action plan? So the action plan for low participation rate along with high chronic absenteeism is believed to have led to the low scores in language arts and math. And so proposals to address this are work with site administrators to review the data, identify the students and determine why they did not take the state assessment as required, use the positive behavior interventions and support, so PBIS, that are already being implemented. And PBIS systems are used in part to also encourage positive attendance. Site administrators will discuss data with case managers and general education teachers. Case managers are these special education teachers who are monitoring the students who are on their caseload, the special education students who are on their caseload. And then train staff on the accommodations available to students with disabilities, including providing reminders that accommodations must be listed on the student's individualized education plan on their IEP. So this next section has to do with least restrictive environment. And before I go into the data, just an explanation of what least restrictive environment is. It means students who receive special education services should be in the same classroom as their general education peers as much as possible. So this is a guiding principle that for as much as possible, students who are on IEPs are integrated into a mainstream class or a general education class. An LRE is going to look different for every student based on their very unique needs and based on what's offered in their IEP. So going down now into those performance indicators, the regular class, which is 80% or more, this is mostly for students who participate in what's called the Resource Specialist Program, RSP program. Students who receive RSP support, they receive the bulk of their instruction in a regular class or general education class, but then they'll receive either pull-out services, maybe push-in services, depending on what their IEP offers, for targeted instruction, you know, language arts or math, you know, for some level of remediation. The target was more than or equal to 60% of students who are in RSP to be in general education 80% or more of their school day. We had, Burbank Unified had 52.68% of our students in the regular class 80% or more of the day. We were right there, super, super close. The next section for performance indicators, and kind of like the last slide, here's the problem. My next slide will talk about what happened and the proposed action plan. The next performance indicator had to do with students ages 3 through 5 in regular class. The target was more than or equal to 41% of those students needing to be in regular class. Burbank Unified had 39.45% of the students in regular class. And then students ages 3 through 5 in a separate school, the target was less than 31%. Burbank Unified had 51.38% placed in a separate school. And so I highlight that, and I'm going to get into this is that piece that I'm going to get into here in just a second.
For understanding the scope of this, how many students do we
serve total that are ages 3 to 5? Because I imagine that's all, is that TK and basically any sort of childcare programs, or?
That's our preschool program.
Yeah,
And I'd have to pull the numbers, the total
Okay.
numbers for preschool. So what happens? So looking at the regular class of 80% or more, the district was off by just 7.32%. When looking at students ages 3 through 5 in regular class, we were only off by 0.55%. And so these appear to be the result of calculation errors in students' IEPs. And so what that means is, as part of IEPs, there's a section where the case carrier has to calculate the percentage that the student is in general education class and is in is receiving special education service. So you have to literally calculate the number of minutes of the school day and deduct any time that they're in general education class in order to come up with those two percentages. And it can be really tedious figuring out those minutes at times. So our department has put a system in place that I'll get to in the action plan. But that's why there's the belief that in part, though we were so close in both of those sections, and we strongly believe that those were calculation errors. With students ages 3 through 5 in a separate school, it's also believed that those are, it's an error in how it's identified on the IEP. There are different drop-down menus to identify when a student is in a regular school at a public school setting, or in a separate school, or in a residential facility. Separate schools tend to, what that means is non-public school, and our preschool students are not in non-public schools. So this is going to be addressed through further exploration by special education leadership. So our action plans are staff training and oversight of IEP documentation completed. Case managers have received training on how to calculate the percentage a student is inside and outside of the regular classroom. That training took place in August. There was also a calculator tool that was created and provided to all of our special education staff to accurately calculate those time percentages. And then special education providers for students ages 3 through 5 will be retrained on how to identify time in and time out of the regular classroom. And here's where I identified again, regular classroom is general education. And special education providers for students ages 3 through 5 may need retraining on California Department of Education's definition of a separate school. Any questions? The last section has to do with the compliance indicator. The compliance indicator is about the timeliness of holding IEPs. So late individualized education plans and initial assessments were being held past the timeline. And so the action plan is to retrain staff and implement monitoring procedures. We started doing this last year as well. Special education staff have already been retrained on legal compliance timelines. We've talked about when our initial IEPs due after an assessment plan is signed. We've talked about when to start scheduling annual IEP meetings to make sure that they're all held within the timeline that they're supposed to be held. There have been and are going to be several reminders throughout the school year that will be provided to case carriers. And what this will look like is on a quarterly basis, our department will poll all of the students' IEPs to see who's coming up and who is already late. And there will be emails sent out to the case carriers to let them know, these are IEPs that are either on the verge or now out of compliance. Please address this straight away. And those the site administration will also be copied. Special education leadership staff will monitor the IEP system and will also make contact with all of the case carriers and site administration. And leadership will, and this is what I'm also saying, leadership will communicate with the case managers and school site administration regarding out of compliance. So overall, these seem like, oh goodness, there were like 4 different areas of compliance issues, but they're really pretty minor. A lot of it had to do with clerical errors that are pretty easily addressed. What can be challenging on the IEP is it's the wording in that percentage area. It says like, student is inside the regular class for this amount of time, for blank percentage of time. Student is outside the regular class for blank percentage of time. And if the case carrier is working too quickly, it's really easy to flip-flop those 2 numbers. And that's where I think that 7.35 or whatever percentage compliance issue came from. So our 3 action plans are, low participation rate along with high chronic absenteeism led to low test scores in language arts and math. We're going to train staff and oversight of IEP documentation completed, and retrain staff and implement monitoring procedures in order to address these issues. Any questions?
I, of course, have a lot, but I'm going to let other folks chime in first. Kelly, did I see your hand go up? Did you have a question?
Yes.
Great.
So for that first action plan, I mean, there could be a lot to unpack as to those reasons, and it may involve resources that the district currently hasn't considered or allocated as to determine why these significant number of students aren't taking the state testing. It could be test anxiety, and how do you deal with that? It could be school aversion, and how do you deal with that? So it's nice to say, yes, we're going to deal with it, but you really need to put the various steps into place in order to truly deal with it. That's as to that action plan. The second action plan as to timelines, I can see where the district is on track to hold the initial IEP meeting. And the problem I have with the district is that the subsequent part 2 or part 3, or in some cases part 4 meetings are significantly delayed. There could be a month apart or more. And in order to get an IEP finalized, I think you've got to hold the meetings more closely together, and you've got to also allow for more time to hold the meetings. At the high school level, sometimes it's just less than an hour, and on an annual IEP, that's just not enough time, especially if there are a lot of concerns that need to be addressed by either by district staff or parents.
I think you bring up really good points, Kelly. Kind of working my way backwards, in terms of the part 2s and 3s, and yes, we've been talking with case managers about holding the IEPs by their timelines so that, hopefully the full IEP can be held within that one sitting, if you will. In terms of the amount of time that IEPs can be held, it's contractual, right? So teachers are only required to attend IEPs for 90-minute segments of time. At the high school level, they have the period that is their prep period that they're able to be out of class. And so that's where those time constraints can come in, is making sure that we have all of the IEP participants who are there at the meeting and available, but then that other students are not losing out on instruction from their teacher as well. So it's this constant juggling. It's juggling a lot. And so what we talk with our IEP teams about when there are a lot of concerns are to really work with the team members, and this includes the family and anyone else who's invited to the IEP, to have an idea of what those concerns are beforehand, so that they can be addressed either before the IEP and then just formally documented at the IEP, or at least have access to what those concerns are, so that way when going through the IEP's agenda for that segment of time, that you're able to get through as many of the concerns as possible within that time frame allotted.
And I've seen the parent concerns handled different ways. Sometimes it is the case carrier or even the school nurse that provides a form to parents to fill out. List your concerns, list your concerns. But I think that there needs to be like a standardized training provided to staff so that it's handled the same. And I think that it would be very helpful for parents to automatically be sent a draft copy of the IEP, including proposed goals. I think that if there is a time constraint, especially at the secondary level, parents desperately need to see the draft IEP, and that should just be an automatic occurrence so that it cuts down on that time of trying to manage all the information that's being thrown at them.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to, work on those time pieces, and those are some good points that you bring up.
Okay, then the last point that I need to make is that there are schools that I'm aware of that have had missing service providers for whatever reason they are. Maybe it's they don't have a speech and language pathologist at one school, or they have somebody out on maternity, or whatever it is. I don't see letters going out to parents saying, district acknowledges that there's a service provider that hasn't been there for X number of days or weeks or whatever the time frame is, and we understand we have an obligation to make up these missing minutes, and we would like to work with you. Some sort of acknowledgement so that it isn't a surprise that's learned at the IEP meeting. And I think that might also, you need to understand that if there are service minutes that need to be made up, that might actually play into, if you're going to do compensatory during the school day, that may play into the percentages between where the kid is pulled out for gen ed versus special ed.
Actually, I would love to chat with you offline about those particular issues, because they're a little bit different from the compliance issues that came up. But if that's something that you're finding is problematic, I would be more than happy to talk with you about which school sites this is happening at, so that we can tackle the problem together. And then going back to what you brought up, the first concern that pertained to statewide assessments, test anxiety and those pieces. It could be any number of things. We were so close, especially in language arts, with having the right amount of participants, 100 off, right? And so it's really identifying who those students are and what those needs are, so that we can get to that 95% plus participation rate in both ELA and math.
Well, and I'm wondering with that one, likely it's going to be very individual to students, right? Like, I don't know that we're going to see a ton of trend data there. But it would be interesting to note if those participation rates have changed since the pandemic or not. We've had kind of SBAC testing for now almost 10 years. And so, the test hasn't changed significantly, is my understanding. But like, is there any sort of changes that are happening in terms of participation rate, either with our special education population or generally? And I don't know, Sharon, if you know that just off the top of your very brilliant head, but it might be something interesting to look into.
Well, I do know that overall that has remained pretty much the same. However, we have had in that period of time waves of groups of parents who have opted out of testing, not just special education students, but all students. And that has impacted our special education numbers as well. So when we
Got
have
it.
that wave, everybody kind of gets involved with that. But it's
Got it.
not, it doesn't happen every year. And I think since I've been at the district, it's happened like 2 or 3 times.
Got it. Thanks. Great questions, Kelly. Thank you.
Right. Last point is, for those special education students that are opted out of state testing, what I have found in the few students that I have come across is that they are performing so low in the curriculum and on the state testings that parents are like, I don't want to put my kid through this. I don't want, I just don't, they don't need to have this thrown in their face that they are a 1 on these state testing. So that's what I was saying. That's one of the challenges that you'll be facing with these parents, that if that's the reason for their opting out, I always try and phrase it as, but this is outside data that you can look and see, is it different than what you're getting in the school setting? All data can be useful. And so I try to convince parents to have their students take these tests. But I think that's what you're going to come across.
Absolutely. And depending on the student and the student's needs, there is an alternative form of the assessment too. I do think there's also value in the student continuing to be with their peers from their classroom. So if they're not necessarily testing in a separate environment, if they're going with the rest of their class, into the computer lab to take the assessment. The other piece too is with the accommodations that are available with testing. Some of the accommodations, if the student's not used to using them, masking, for example, or looking at figuring out how to like chunk it in a different way, the student's able to practice some of those accommodations before actually taking the assessment itself.
Maybe that could be rolled into a parent training at those CDAC meetings. That might be a way to help bridge that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Jennifer, can I add one more thing about that too? Is that I think, Kelly, you bring up a really good point in that parents don't really want to see their kids suffer through a test, but really all the state is asking is for them to attempt it. So at the point where they become frustrated or anxious, they can quit, but we could still count them as a participant. So that's important for parents to know too.
And that's what I have for you for tonight.
What other questions, noticings do folks have on this data? And I want to make sure we're including our friends that are hanging out in the district office too. Hopefully they were able to hear most of this. All right, I've waited. I'm uncomfortable. I tried. It's the thing I was worst at as a teacher. Well, no, there's lots of things I was worse at, maybe. So I think this is all super helpful data. I'm curious, so, in an ideal world, right, we're getting participation rates up high and the students are feeling good about that, or at least we're getting a data back that is going to help us accommodate them better. I guess it's hard for me to look at the numbers for even just the achievement rates, without kind of wanting to go in there a little bit deeper. Especially as like, do we think about that kind of gap, right? As again, like I always go back to like trying to figure out the context for this is like, is that normal for our special education students to be that far below standard? Is that kind of what other districts and kind of the statewide averages look at? And like, I can mess around on the dashboard and figure that out. But I think like that's something that would be helpful context for this group as we think about kind of future agenda items too, is like, okay, like, you know, ultimately we want all of our students to be able to perform at standard, right? But I think we also want to know like, how are we doing? And is there anything that we can either learn from others or even celebrate, right? It's very possible that we're doing better for our special education students, but it doesn't look like that from this report. So I'm curious if there was additional data on the performance indicators for our students.
There is additional data. What I did take a look at, and I don't have those numbers, is how far our overall numbers from the standard, what it looks like compared to other districts.
Mm-hmm.
And really in both language arts and math, we were right within those average ranges and doing better than some of the other districts.
Yeah, that's helpful. And was there additional kind of commentary from like on that kind of needs improvement piece?
Not that I was looking into. I was focused
Okay.
more on the special education piece. And
oh yeah, no, I just mean like from the folks who did the kind of write up. But that's helpful.
One thing
Other-
that I can tell you is that for the last 10 years, special education has been one of our significant subgroups who have not been at grade level standard. However, I would say that the gap right now is the largest it has been coming out of the pandemic, because they were some of the students who were most affected and impacted by the lack of, in-person instruction. So we're still feeling that, but so it's not a new subgroup, but this number is, or the gap has grown.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful, especially as we go into kind of LCAP season, right? And thinking about where we want to focus our funding. That's a subgroup that we could pull out. Other questions, comments from the group? All right. Well, remind me, Ms. Casea, what we had for, we aren't going to have a meeting next month because it would be like on Christmas, I think even. So we're skipping December. I'm forgetting what I should look at these things before we meet. But if you have off the top of your head what we said we were going to do in January, no?
I don't. Does
That's okay.
anyone? Shoot.
We'll review it. We'll bring it up and remember. I think it might have been the no, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate wildly because that's what it would be. But this was really good data. So thank you for sharing it with us and answering all of our questions. And folks, like, we're going to do this on Zoom, I think, for the rest of the school year, is the plan, so that we can, I think, to try to make it easier for folks to participate. I'm open to feedback on that. And I think we're trying to see how it goes forward. And whether it's easier for folks to participate. It may be a committee dependent kind of thing. So But I'm happy to see you all. And I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And I'll see most of you sooner, but Happy New Year if I don't see you before then. All right.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Terry.